The house was my sanctuary, built brick by brick with love and sweat. My adopted son, once my pride, tried to steal it from me. I outsmarted him in a single night. My name is Yvonne Hargrove. I'm 67 years old, a retired school librarian here in Boise, Idaho. I live alone now, surrounded by books and memories in the same two-story home where I raised my adopted son, Henry. My days are quiet these days, tending my garden, volunteering down at the local library, sipping coffee on the front porch where I once watched Henry play catch with the neighbor kids. But the scars of betrayal still linger, etched into my heart, just like the lines time has carved across my face. 40 years ago, I chose Henry. He was a wide-eyed little boy with a laugh that could fill up entire rooms. I gave him everything a mother could give. A warm home, a good education, my complete trust. He was my family, my legacy, the child I never thought I'd have. But greed has a way of twisting love into something you don't recognize anymore. For years, I carried the weight of what he did to me in silence. The courthouse battles, the lies he told about my mental state, the way he tried to paint me as some confused old woman who couldn't take care of herself. All so he could get his hands on this house while I was still breathing. Well, let me tell you something. I may be getting older, but I'm nobody's fool. This is the story of how I lost the son I raised, how I fought back when he tried to take everything from me, and how I learned that sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone walk all over you again. It's a story for anyone who's ever been betrayed by the people they held closest to their heart. Anyone who's had to choose between their own peace of mind and the complicated mess that family can become. If you're watching this, and you've got your own story of family betrayal, of having to protect what's rightfully yours, then you'll understand what I went through. And maybe, just maybe, my story will help you find your own way through the darkness. Back in the 1980s, Boise was a smaller place, warmer somehow. Neighbors actually knew each other's names, and you could leave your front door unlocked without a second thought. I was 29 then, single, working as a school librarian and aching for something more. Teaching other people's children every day just wasn't enough. I wanted a child of my own to come home to. That's when I met Henry at the county foster care office. He was 6 years old, this little slip of a boy with sandy hair and the biggest brown eyes you ever saw. He was shy at first, hiding behind the social worker's legs, but when I knelt down and asked him about the comic book he was clutching, it was Spider-Man, his whole face just lit up. The adoption process took months, but I knew from that first meeting he was meant to be mine. When I finally brought him home to this very house, the same one my parents left me, it felt like all the pieces of my life finally fit together. Those early years were pure magic. We'd spend Saturday mornings building blanket forts right here in the living room, reading those Spider-Man comics over and over until the pages started falling out. I'd make us chocolate chip cookies, and we'd always burn the first batch because we'd get so caught up in our stories and forget to set the timer. Henry had this laugh. Lord, that boy could laugh. It would start as this little giggle and then just bubble up until it filled the whole house. I used to think that sound alone made every sacrifice worth it. My younger sister, Grace, she lives down in Portland, was like a second mother to Henry. She's 10 years younger than me, always been the more adventurous one. She'd drive up every other weekend with a trunk full of toys and treats, teaching Henry how to whistle, how to skip stones in the Boise River. Grace would joke that she was the fun aunt and I was the responsible mom, and we both liked it that way. This house became our world. Henry learned to ride his bike in that driveway out there. We'd sit on this same front porch during summer evenings, watching him chase fireflies with the neighbor kids. I worked extra shifts at the school library to pay for his Little League uniforms, his field trips, all those dreams that cost more than a single mother's salary should allow. But I didn't mind. This house that my parents worked so hard for, that they left to me, it felt right filling it with a child's laughter again. Henry grew up in these rooms, did his homework at the kitchen table, measured his height against the doorframe in the hallway year after year. When he graduated high school in 2002, I was so proud I thought my heart might burst. Valedictorian of his class, full scholarship to the University of Washington in Seattle. Grace drove up for the ceremony, and we both cried watching him walk across that stage. "He's going to make it big, Yvonne," Grace whispered to me that night. "That boy's going to take care of us both someday." I believed her. We both did. Henry was our golden boy, our success story. The kid who came from nothing and was going to have everything. When he left for college, I stood in his empty bedroom and felt this bittersweet mix of pride and loneliness. But that's what good mothers do, right? They raise their children to fly away and build their own lives. Those college years, he'd call every Sunday without fail. Tell me about his classes, his friends, his plans for the future. He was studying business and computer science, always talking about the technology boom, how Seattle was where the future was being built. Grace and I would spend hours on the phone, sharing Henry's stories like proud family members do. How smart he was, how driven, how he was going to graduate and get some big, important job and make us all proud. Looking back now, I can see those were the last truly happy years we had as a family. Before life got complicated. Before money and greed and grown-up problems crept in and changed everything between us. But for a while there, we had something beautiful. A real family, built not on blood, but on choice and love, and the kind of trust that makes you believe it'll last forever. I should have known nothing that perfect stays that way for long. Henry changed somewhere in his 20s, and I wish I could pinpoint exactly when it happened. After he graduated college in 2006, he stayed up in Seattle, chasing after this tech job that never quite seemed to materialize. Those Sunday phone calls I'd come to depend on started getting shorter, then less frequent. Pretty soon, weeks would go by without hearing his voice. When he did call, he sounded different, distracted, always rushing to get off the phone because he had some meeting, some opportunity he had to chase down. He'd talk about investments and business ventures in a way that made my stomach twist with worry, though I couldn't quite say why. The visits home became rare as hen's teeth, maybe twice a year if I was lucky, and when he did show up, it was like having a stranger in my house. He'd spend most of his time on that cell phone of his, pacing around the living room talking to people I'd never heard of about money I didn't understand. But what really got to me was the way he started looking at everything. Not the way you look at a childhood home with fond memories, but the way you size something up. He'd ask questions that felt off. How much was the house worth now? Was there still a mortgage? How much land came with the property? "Just curious, Mom," he'd say when I'd give him a funny look. "Real estate's exploding everywhere. You're sitting on a gold mine here." I'd brush it off. Tell myself he was just making conversation. Mothers have a talent for explaining away the things that don't sit right, don't we? We want so badly to believe our children are still the people we raised them to be. Grace noticed it too. She'd come up from Portland for her regular visits, and after Henry would leave, she'd pull me aside with that concerned look she gets. "He's different, Yvonne," she said after one particularly awkward weekend in 2008. "That's not our Henry anymore. Something's changed in him." I defended him, of course. Told Grace he was just trying to find his way in the world, that some people take longer to settle down than others. But deep in my heart, I knew she was right. The boy who used to sit with me on the front porch talking about his dreams had been replaced by this man who couldn't look me in the eye. The requests for money started small. A few hundred here and there for business expenses, or to tide him over until his next opportunity came through. He'd call with this edge in his voice, not exactly desperate, but close to it, explaining how this loan or that investment had fallen through. I sent what I could. What mother wouldn't? I dipped into my retirement savings, my emergency fund, telling myself it was temporary. That once Henry got on his feet, everything would go back to normal. But normal never came. The amounts got bigger. $1,000 to help with rent, $2,000 for a down payment on some business deal that was going to change everything. Each time, he'd promise to pay me back with interest, swear this was the last time he'd need to ask. I started lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering where I'd gone wrong. Had I been too soft on him growing up? Too protective? Should I have taught him more about handling money, about the value of hard work? Grace would call after hearing about the latest loan, her voice tight with worry and frustration. "You're enabling him, Yvonne, can't you see that? Every time you bail him out, you're just making it easier for him to make bad choices." But what was I supposed to do? Let my son end up on the streets? He was all the family I had besides Grace, the child I'd chosen and loved and raised. You don't just turn your back on that, no matter how much it hurts. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that Henry wasn't just taking my money. He was keeping track of every dollar, every conversation, every moment I showed concern about his choices. He was building a case, piece by piece, conversation by conversation. He was gathering ammunition to use against me. All those questions about the house, all that talk about my financial decisions, he wasn't making conversation. He was studying me, looking for weaknesses, for ways to convince other people that I wasn't capable of managing my own affairs. The distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore. It was strategic. He was pulling away so he could come back later as an adversary instead of a son. I just didn't see it coming. In March of 2015, I got a letter that knocked the wind clean out of me. Official court documents, thick paper with legal seals, delivered right to my front door by some kid who couldn't have been more than 20. I signed for it with shaking hands, not knowing my whole world was about to come crashing down. Henry had filed a lawsuit against me. My own son, the boy I'd raised from 6 years old, was trying to take my house away from me while I was still breathing. The papers used words like mental incompetence and diminished capacity. They claimed I was no longer fit to manage my own property, that I was making poor financial decisions, and showing signs of cognitive decline. According to Henry's lawyer, I needed a conservator, him, to protect me from myself. It was all lies built on half-truths and twisted facts. Yes, I'd had a minor stroke the year before. Scared me to death when it happened, right there in the produce section at Albertsons. But I recovered just fine, did all my physical therapy, got clearance from my doctor to live independently. My mind was as sharp as it ever was. Yes, I'd been sending Henry money over the years. But that wasn't poor judgment. That was a mother trying to help her struggling son. Every parent watching this knows exactly what I'm talking about. But Henry had taken those two things and woven them into this story that painted me as some confused old woman, hoarding a house she couldn't take care of, making irrational financial choices. He'd somehow convinced my cousin Robert, my own blood, to sign an affidavit saying I seemed forgetful during family gatherings. Got our old family friend Martha to testify that I'd seemed overwhelmed when she'd visited the previous Christmas. The betrayal wasn't just from Henry. It was from people I'd trusted, people who should have known better. I called Grace the minute I finished reading those papers, barely able to get the words out through my tears. She drove up from Portland that same day, took one look at the documents, and started making phone calls. Found me a lawyer, Patricia Collins, a tough woman in her 50s who specialized in elder law. "This is what we call a predatory conservatorship," Patricia explained during our first meeting. Family members use trumped-up claims of incompetence to gain control of property or assets. It happens more than you'd think. The legal fees started draining my savings immediately. Every motion, every response, every court appearance, it all cost money I didn't have to spare. But what choice did I have? I was fighting for my home, my independence, my dignity. The worst part was sitting in that courthouse, looking across the room at Henry. He was 38 years old then, wearing a suit I probably helped pay for, avoiding my eyes like I was some stranger he'd never met. His lawyer would paint this picture of a frail, confused woman who couldn't remember to pay her bills or keep track of her medications. Then I'd have to stand up and defend my own sanity. Show bank statements proving I managed my finances just fine. Medical records showing my stroke recovery was complete. Testimony from my doctor, my neighbors, the head librarian where I volunteered. "Mrs. Hargrove," Patricia would ask me in front of the judge, "do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" "I understand perfectly," I'd answer, looking right at Henry when I said it. My son wants to take my house away from me, and he's willing to lie to do it. Grace was there for every hearing, sitting right behind me, whispering encouragement when I needed it most. After one particularly brutal session where Henry's lawyer had grilled me about every check I'd written in the past 5 years, Grace followed me out to the courthouse steps. "How could he do this?" she asked, her voice shaking with rage. "How could he sit there and watch them tear you apart like that?" I didn't have an answer then. I still don't, not really. The case dragged on for months. Each hearing chipped away at my spirit a little more. Even though I knew I was mentally competent, even though I had documentation proving it, there's something devastating about having to defend your own sanity in a room full of strangers. Henry's claim was that putting the house in his name would protect it for the future, that I was too old and too confused to maintain the property properly, that this was all for my own good. But I could see the truth in his eyes during those court sessions. This wasn't about protecting anything. This was about money. About him getting his hands on the one valuable thing I owned, the house my parents had worked their whole lives to buy, the home where I'd raised him with nothing but love. The judge was skeptical of Henry's claims from the start, thank God. Judge Martinez had been on the bench for 20 years and had seen his share of family financial disputes. He asked pointed questions about Henry's motives, about why he couldn't simply wait for his inheritance like a normal person. But even with a judge who seemed to be on my side, the process was brutal. Every aspect of my life got picked apart and examined. My grocery receipts, my medical appointments, my volunteer work. It all became evidence in this twisted case my own son had built against me. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever felt. This wasn't just about money or property. This was personal. This was the child I'd chosen, the boy I'd loved and raised and sacrificed for, trying to have me declared incompetent so he could take everything I had left. Some wounds never heal completely. The scar tissue just grows over them, and you learn to live with the ache. After what turned out to be our final court hearing in October 2015, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I'd sat through months of legal proceedings, listened to Henry's lawyer tear apart my character, watched my own son nod along as they painted me as some confused old fool. But when we walked out of that courthouse, something inside me just snapped. Henry was walking toward his rental car, probably planning to drive back to Seattle without so much as a goodbye, when I called out to him. "Henry? Henry? You stop right there." He turned around, and for just a second, I saw a flicker of the little boy I used to know. But it was gone so fast I might have imagined it. "Why?" I asked him, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to stay strong. "Why this? Why couldn't you just wait like any normal person would?" He couldn't look me in the eye, just stared at his shoes like he used to do when he was 8 years old, and I'd caught him in a lie about breaking something. "You wouldn't understand, Mom," he muttered. "The house is just sitting here. You can't maintain it properly. It's too much for you." "Too much for me?" The anger in my voice surprised even me. "I've been maintaining this house just fine for 40 years. I raised you in this house. I've never missed a mortgage payment, never let anything fall apart. What exactly is too much for me?" That's when Grace stepped in. She'd been quiet during the whole court process, supporting me but letting the lawyers do their talking. But now she was done with diplomacy. "Cut the crap, Henry," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "This isn't about Mom's capacity to maintain anything. This is about you wanting money you haven't earned for a life you can't afford." Henry's face changed then. The fake concern, the pretend worry about my well-being, it all fell away and I saw what was really underneath. Anger, resentment, and something uglier than that. "You two don't understand what it's like out there," he snapped. "Everything costs more than you can imagine. I've got opportunities, real chances to make something of myself, but I need capital. I need backing." "So you decided to steal from your mother?" Grace shot back. "It's not stealing." Henry's voice got louder, attracting stares from other people leaving the courthouse. "It's my inheritance anyway. You're both just sitting on it while I'm struggling to survive." That word, inheritance, hit me like a physical blow. I felt dizzy, had to reach out and grab Grace's arm to steady myself. "Your inheritance?" I repeated, barely able to get the words out. "Henry, I'm still alive. This is my home. I live here. I work in my garden there. I have my books, my memories. This isn't some asset sitting empty waiting for you to claim it. This is my life." But he wasn't listening anymore. He was wound up, years of frustration pouring out all at once. "You don't get it," he said, running his hands through his thinning hair. "You and Grace, you're holding me back. That house is worth $300,000, maybe more. I could use that equity. I could invest it. I could actually build something instead of living paycheck to paycheck." "While I what?" I asked. "Move into some nursing home so you can cash out on the house I've lived in my entire adult life? You could live with Grace, or get a nice little apartment somewhere. You don't need all that space." Grace stepped between us then, her face flushed red with anger. "Listen to me very carefully, you selfish little worm," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "That woman behind me worked 2 jobs to put you through Little League. She gave up dates, vacations, new clothes, everything so you could have what you needed. She emptied her savings account more times than I can count to bail you out of whatever mess you'd gotten yourself into. And now you want to throw her out of her own home so you can play businessman with money that isn't yours?" Henry turned on Grace then, all pretense of family loyalty gone. "This is between me and Mom, Grace. You don't get a vote in this." "The hell I don't," Grace shot back. "I've been cleaning up your messes and talking Yvonne out of cutting you off for years. I watched you bleed her dry with your sob stories and your promises to pay her back. You want to know what holding you back looks like? Look in the mirror." That's when Henry said something I'll never forget, something that cut whatever remaining thread connected us. "You're both just bitter old women who never made anything of yourselves. You can't stand to see someone else succeed." The silence that followed was deafening. Cars were driving by. People were walking past us. Life was continuing all around. But in that moment, everything felt frozen. "Get away from me," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Get away from me, and don't you ever come back." "Mom?" "No." I held up my hand to stop him. "You made your choice, Henry. You chose greed over family. You chose lies over love. You chose to try and destroy the woman who raised you rather than build your own life like an adult." I looked at him one last time, trying to find some trace of the little boy who used to read comic books with me on Saturday mornings. But that boy was gone, if he'd ever really existed at all. "I don't have a son anymore," I said. Henry stood there for another few seconds, maybe waiting for me to take it back. When I didn't, he turned and walked to his car without another word. I watched him drive away, and I felt the final thread that connected us snap like an old rubber band. Grace put her arm around my shoulders as I cried. Not tears of sadness, exactly, but tears of release. Of finally accepting what I'd been trying to deny for years. The boy I'd loved was gone, and the man he'd become wasn't welcome in my life anymore. The next 5 years passed quietly. Too quietly, if I'm being honest. After that confrontation outside the courthouse, I went home and changed the locks on my doors. It felt necessary, but it also felt final in a way that made my chest ache. The house that used to echo with Henry's laughter became a tomb of silence. I'd catch myself setting two places at the kitchen table out of habit, then have to put one away. His old bedroom upstairs still had his comic books on the shelves, gathering dust like everything else from that part of my life. Grace visited when she could, driving up from Portland every month or two, but she had her own life, her own struggles with the bookstore she managed. And honestly, we both avoided talking about Henry. What was there to say? The wound was too fresh, too deep, and picking at it wouldn't help anyone heal. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, just like Patricia Collins had predicted it would be. Judge Martinez saw right through Henry's claims, threw the whole thing out in February 2016. I should have felt vindicated, triumphant even. But victory felt hollow when it came at the cost of losing your child. People around town would ask about Henry sometimes. Neighbors who remembered him as that sweet little boy riding his bike up and down the street, or folks from church who'd watched him grow up in the pews beside me. I learned to smile and change the subject, developed a whole repertoire of deflections. "Oh, he's doing well up in Seattle," I'd say. Or, "You know how busy young people get with their careers." Anything to avoid the truth that I had no idea where he was or what he was doing, and that most days, I tried not to think about it. The nights were the hardest. I'd sit on the front porch with my coffee, same as always, but now I was watching other people's children play in their yards. Sometimes I'd remember Henry at that age, chasing lightning bugs with a mason jar, convinced he could catch enough to light up his whole bedroom. Those memories felt like looking at photographs of someone else's life. I kept myself busy. Routine became my salvation. Up at 6 every morning, coffee and the newspaper on the porch. Tending my garden, tomatoes and green beans and the roses my mother planted before she passed. Volunteering at the library 3 days a week, helping other people's grandchildren learn to love books the way I'd tried to teach Henry. The silence wasn't just in my house, it was in my heart, too. I stopped talking about my family, stopped mentioning that I had a son. When new people asked if I had children, I'd just say no and let them assume I'd never been blessed that way. It was easier than explaining that I'd raised a child for 30 years, only to have him try to steal my home from under me. Grace worried about me during those years. She'd call more often than she needed to, checking in, making sure I wasn't disappearing into myself completely. Sometimes she'd try to bring up Henry, suggest that maybe enough time had passed, that maybe I should consider reaching out. "People make mistakes, Yvonne," she'd say carefully. "Even big ones. Maybe he's learned something from all this." But I wasn't ready. Maybe I was too proud, or maybe I was just too hurt. The idea of opening that door again, of making myself vulnerable to that kind of betrayal twice, felt impossible. I started writing letters to Henry around year 3. Never sent them, just needed somewhere to put all the words that had been building up inside me. Letters asking why. Letters explaining how much he'd hurt me. Letters that oscillated between anger and grief sometimes in the same paragraph. I kept those letters in a shoebox in my bedroom closet, right next to the box of photos from when he was little. Some nights I'd take them both out, read the letters I'd written and look at pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and Little League games. Trying to reconcile the smiling boy in the photos with the man who'd sat in a courtroom and called me mentally incompetent. Time didn't heal anything, no matter what people say about that. It just taught me how to carry the pain without letting it consume me completely. I learned to wake up each morning and choose to keep going. Not because I wanted to particularly, but because that's what you do. Life doesn't wait for you to finish grieving. By 2020, I'd settled into this new version of myself. The woman who lived alone, who had a sister instead of children, who volunteered at the library and grew prize-winning tomatoes and had learned to be content with her own company. I thought that was how the story would end. Me growing old in this house, surrounded by books and memories, with Grace visiting when she could, and a garden that bloomed every spring whether anyone was there to appreciate it or not. I thought I'd learned to live with the silence. I was wrong. By 2020, I was 62 and tired of living like a ghost in my own house. The silence had become suffocating, and I realized I had a choice to make. I could keep mourning the family I'd lost, or I could start building something new from what was left. It started small. I joined a book club at the community center, something I'd been meaning to do for years but never found the time. Turned out there were a dozen other women my age who loved mysteries as much as I did, and we'd spend Tuesday evenings dissecting Agatha Christie novels and arguing about whether we'd figured out the killer before the big reveal. Those women, Ruth and Margaret and Susan and the others, they didn't know about Henry. They knew me as Yvonne, the retired librarian who always brought homemade oatmeal cookies to meetings and had strong opinions about unreliable narrators. It felt good to be seen as just myself again, not as someone's mother or someone's victim. Then I started the community garden project. The lot next to the library had been sitting empty for years, just weeds and broken glass. I approached the city council with a proposal to turn it into raised beds where neighbors could grow vegetables together. Something about digging in the dirt, planting seeds, watching things grow. It felt like hope taking root again. The project brought people together in ways I hadn't expected. Young mothers teaching their children to plant beans, elderly men sharing stories about the victory gardens their parents kept during the war, teenagers who discovered they actually enjoyed working with their hands. We built something beautiful together, something that fed people both literally and spiritually. Grace noticed the change in me during her visits. I was laughing more, talking about my new friends, making plans beyond just getting through each day. "You seem lighter somehow," she told me during a weekend visit in the fall of 2020. We were sitting on the front porch, watching the leaves change colors, and I realized she was right. "I think I'm finally learning how to be alone without being lonely," I said. That Christmas, Grace convinced me to take a trip with her to the Oregon coast. We rented a little cabin in Cannon Beach for a long weekend, spent our days walking on the sand and our evenings playing cards by the fireplace. We laughed like we were teenagers again, telling stories about our childhood, remembering good times instead of dwelling on the recent pain. It was the first vacation I'd taken in years, and I came home feeling refreshed in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. I decided to renovate parts of the house after that trip. Not to erase Henry's presence completely, but to reclaim the space for myself. I painted the living room a warm yellow that made everything feel brighter. Put up new curtains in the kitchen, ones with sunflowers that made me smile every time I looked at them. I turned Henry's old bedroom into a proper guest room, finally packing away those comic books and storing them in the basement. Grace helped me pick out new bedding, a soft blue that made the room feel peaceful instead of haunted. The hardest part was what to do with all those letters I'd been writing to Henry. Hundreds of pages of anger and grief and unanswered questions, sitting in that shoebox like emotional dynamite. I thought about burning them, about mailing them, about pretending they'd never existed. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I read them all, one by one, and then I wrote myself a letter back. A letter of forgiveness, not for Henry, but for me. For the mistakes I'd made as a mother, for the signs I'd missed, for the way I'd let his betrayal define me for so long. That letter went in the shoebox too, but somehow its presence changed the weight of everything else in there. I started taking a watercolor painting class at the senior center. Turns out I had no natural talent whatsoever for art. But there was something soothing about mixing colors on a palette, about trying to capture the way light fell across my garden in the early morning. My paintings looked like a child had done them, but they were mine, and that mattered. The woman I was becoming felt familiar, but different. Still Yvonne, still the retired librarian who loved books and grew vegetables, but stronger somehow, more complete in herself. I wasn't waiting for anyone to come home anymore. I wasn't holding my breath for phone calls that might never come. I was building a life that belonged entirely to me. Looking back, I think those quiet years of reconstruction were necessary. You can't build something new on a foundation that's still crumbling. You have to clear the debris first, lay new groundwork, learn to trust in your own strength before you can handle whatever comes next. I thought I had learned to live without Henry permanently. I thought the door between us had been closed for good. I should have known that life rarely lets you stay comfortable for long. It was a Tuesday evening in September 2023, when my carefully reconstructed world got turned upside down again. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when I heard a knock at the front door. Not the confident rap of a neighbor, or the quick double tap of a delivery driver, but something hesitant, almost apologetic. I dried my hands on the dish towel and walked to the front door, flicking on the porch light as I went. Through the window, I could see a figure standing there, head down, hands shoved deep in jacket pockets. Something about the posture looked familiar, but my brain couldn't quite process what my eyes were seeing. I opened the door, and time seemed to stop. Henry stood on my front porch, 45 years old now, but he looked older than that, much older. His face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked in a way that spoke of too many missed meals. His hair, which had been thick and brown when I'd last seen him, was now streaked with gray and thinning on top. But it was his eyes that shocked me most. They looked exhausted, defeated in a way that made my heart clench despite everything that had happened between us. "Hello, Mom," he said quietly. I stood there frozen, one hand still gripping the doorknob, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't the angry, entitled man who'd walked away from me 8 years ago. This was someone who looked broken, worn down by life in ways I could see, but didn't understand. "Henry." His name came out as barely a whisper. "I know I don't have the right to be here," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I know you told me never to come back, but I didn't know where else to go." Grace happened to be visiting that weekend. Thank God for small mercies. And she appeared behind me in the hallway, drawn by the voices. I heard her sharp intake of breath when she saw who was standing on my porch. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice tight with disbelief and anger. Henry looked at Grace, then back at me. "I lost everything, Mom. My job, my apartment, He swallowed hard. "My marriage fell apart 2 years ago. I've been living in my car for the past month." The words hit me like physical blows. Whatever I'd imagined Henry's life was like during our years of silence, it hadn't been this. I'd pictured him successful, maybe even wealthy, living the high life on whatever schemes he'd been chasing back then. Not this hollow-eyed man who looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. "What do you want, Henry?" Grace asked before I could find my voice. Her tone was cold, protective. She'd moved to stand beside me, a wall of sisterly defense. "I don't want anything," Henry said, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Defeat, maybe, or just bone-deep exhaustion. I need a place to stay tonight, maybe 2 nights. I'm trying to get to Salt Lake City, see if I can find work there. I've got enough gas money to get there, but I need to clean up first, get some sleep." I stared at him, this stranger who wore my son's face, trying to reconcile the person in front of me with the man who'd tried to steal my house. He wasn't demanding anything now. He wasn't trying to manipulate or scheme. He was just asking for basic human kindness from the woman who'd raised him. "Absolutely not," Grace said firmly. "Yvonne, don't even think about it. This is exactly how it started before. Him showing up with some sob story, pulling at your heartstrings." But something in Henry's eyes stopped me from immediately agreeing with Grace. I'd seen him lie before, seen him put on performances designed to get what he wanted. This wasn't that. This was raw desperation, the kind that strips away all pretense and leaves someone standing naked in their need. "I'm not asking for money," Henry continued, his voice barely audible now. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for things to go back to how they were. I know I burned those bridges. I need one night to sleep somewhere that isn't the front seat of a Honda Civic. Grace was shaking her head vigorously, and I understood her reaction completely. Henry had hurt me in ways that had taken years to heal from. Letting him into my house again felt like inviting disaster, like opening myself up to be betrayed all over again. But looking at him standing there in clothes that looked like they hadn't been properly washed in weeks, seeing the way his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel ever again when it came to Henry. I felt sorry for him. "One night," I heard myself saying. "You can sleep on the couch tonight, but you're gone tomorrow morning, and this doesn't change anything between us." Grace turned to stare at me like I'd lost my mind. "Yvonne, what are you doing?" "I don't know," I admitted, and I truly didn't. This went against every instinct I'd developed over the past 8 years, every wall I'd built to protect myself from further pain. Henry's relief was visible, his whole body seeming to sag as tension left his shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered. "I won't cause any trouble. I'll be gone first thing in the morning, I promise." I stepped aside to let him in, watching as he looked around the living room with eyes that seemed to be seeing ghosts. The house had changed since he'd last been here. New paint, different furniture, 100 small alterations that marked the passage of time and my own healing process. That night, I lay awake in my bedroom, listening to the sounds of someone moving around downstairs. It had been 8 years since I'd had another person sleeping under my roof. 8 years since I'd had to think about anyone but myself when I made my morning coffee or decided what to watch on television. I didn't know what morning would bring, or what this unexpected reunion might mean. All I knew was that life had just gotten complicated again. The next morning, I found Henry sitting at my kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. Grace was already up, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, watching him like a hawk watches a mouse. "There's eggs in the fridge if you want to make some breakfast," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. I wasn't sure what the protocol was for feeding the son who'd tried to steal your house 8 years ago. "I'm not really hungry," Henry replied, but his stomach chose that moment to growl loudly enough that we all heard it. Grace rolled her eyes. "When's the last time you ate a real meal?" Henry's laugh was bitter. "Define real meal. I had a burger from McDonald's dollar menu 3 days ago." That's when he broke down. I've seen grown men cry before, but this was different. This was the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and desperate, the kind that shakes your whole body because it's been building up for too long. Henry put his head in his hands and just sobbed, right there at my kitchen table where we used to eat Saturday morning pancakes when he was 12. Grace and I exchanged glances. Her expression had softened slightly, but I could see she was still on guard. "Henry," I said gently, settling into the chair across from him. "What happened? I mean really happened, not just the highlights." It took him several minutes to compose himself enough to speak, and when he did, the story that came out was uglier than I'd imagined. The tech job he'd been chasing all those years never materialized. He'd spent his 20s and early 30s jumping from one get-rich-quick scheme to another, always convinced that the next opportunity would be the one that made him wealthy. He'd gotten involved with some business partners who turned out to be running a borderline illegal operation, lost what little money he had, and ended up in debt to people who weren't patient about getting paid back. "That's when I came up with the idea about the house," he admitted, still not looking at me directly. "These guys I was working with, they said if I could get access to some collateral, some property I could leverage, they could set me up in a real business, something legitimate." "So you decided to have me declared mentally incompetent," I said flatly. He winced. "I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that you'd be better off in a smaller place, that I'd pay you back once the business took off. I know how that sounds now, but at the time you were desperate and looking for the easy way out," Grace finished coldly. Henry nodded miserably. Yeah, that's exactly what I was doing. The business partners disappeared with what little money he'd managed to scrape together. His marriage to a woman named Jennifer started falling apart around the same time. Apparently, she'd figured out that Henry's promises about their financial future were built on quicksand. The divorce was finalized 2 years ago, and she'd gotten most of what they had left, which wasn't much. I've been couch surfing for the past year, he continued. Staying with friends until they got tired of me, then moving on to the next person willing to help, but that well dried up about a month ago. Nobody wants to enable a 45-year-old man who can't get his life together. His car was a 2008 Honda Civic with over 200,000 miles on it, barely running and serving as both transportation and shelter. He'd been doing odd jobs, day labor, delivery driving when his car was behaving, but it wasn't enough to afford rent anywhere, not even for a studio apartment. I thought about calling you so many times, he said, finally looking up at me, especially after Jennifer left. But what was I supposed to say? Hi, Mom. Remember when I tried to steal your house? Can you help me out? Grace snorted. At least you had some self-awareness left. I deserve that, Henry said quietly. I deserve all of it. I made my choices, and I have to live with the consequences. But then his voice got smaller, more fragile. The thing is, Mom, I've been thinking a lot during these past few months. When you're sleeping in your car, you have a lot of time to think. And I keep coming back to the same question. How did I become this person? How did I turn into someone who would hurt the one person who always believed in me? That hit me harder than I expected it to, because I'd been asking myself the same question for 8 years. I don't expect forgiveness, Henry continued. I don't even think I deserve it, but I need to try to make things right somehow, even if it's too late. I need to figure out how to be a decent human being again. He looked around the kitchen, taking in the sunflower curtains I'd hung during my renovation phase, the little herb garden growing on the windowsill. This place looks good, he said. Peaceful. You seem, I don't know, happier than when I last saw you. I am, I said simply. It took me a while to get there, but I am. I'm glad, he said, and something in his voice made me believe he meant it. You deserved better than what I put you through. Grace was still watching this whole exchange with suspicion, but I could see her armor starting to crack slightly. She'd always had a soft spot for lost causes, even when the lost cause had hurt people she loved. What do you need, Henry? I asked finally. I mean specifically, what would help you get back on your feet? He looked surprised, like he hadn't expected me to ask that question. I don't know, he said honestly. I've been focused on just surviving day to day for so long, I haven't thought much beyond that. Maybe just knowing that I'm not completely alone in the world, that there might still be people who care enough to want me to do better. That's when I realized this conversation was about to get a lot more complicated. After Henry told his story, Grace and I spent the next hour walking around my neighborhood while he showered and tried to make himself presentable. We needed space to process what we'd just heard, and we both needed to say things we couldn't say in front of him. Don't even think about it, Yvonne, Grace said before I could open my mouth. I can see those wheels turning in your head, and I'm telling you right now, don't do it. Don't do what? I asked, though we both knew exactly what she was talking about. Don't try to save him. Don't let him pull you back into his mess. You've worked too hard to build a good life for yourself to throw it away on someone who's already proven he'll betray you. We'd reached the little park at the end of my street, the one where I used to bring Henry when he was small. I sat down on the same bench where I used to watch him play on the swings, and Grace sat beside me. He seems different, I said quietly. Of course he seems different. He's desperate. People always seem different when they need something from you. Grace wasn't wrong. I'd seen this pattern before, Henry showing up with problems that somehow became my problems to solve. But something about this felt different, and I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Remember when he was 8 and he broke Mrs. Patterson's window with a baseball? I asked. Grace frowned. What does that have to do with anything? He could have lied about it, could have said it was one of the other kids, or claimed he wasn't even playing near her house. But he came straight home and told me what happened, even though he knew he'd be in trouble. That was 30 years ago, Yvonne. I know, but that little boy, the one who told the truth even when it hurt, maybe he's still in there somewhere. Grace turned to face me fully. And maybe he's not. Maybe that little boy grew up to be a man who lies to judges and tries to steal from his mother. Maybe some people just turn out bad, no matter how much love you give them. That stung, but I couldn't argue with it entirely. I'd spent years wondering what I'd done wrong, what signs I'd missed, how I'd failed as a mother. But what if it wasn't my fault? What if some people just make choices that take them too far down the wrong path to find their way back? What if he's telling the truth this time? I asked. What if he really has learned something from hitting rock bottom? Then he can prove it by rebuilding his life without dragging you into it, Grace said firmly. You don't owe him anything, Yvonne. You gave him 18 years of love and support. You gave him a home, an education, opportunities most kids would kill for. And he repaid you by trying to steal your house. The debt between you two is settled, and not in his favor. We sat in silence for a while, watching a young mother push her toddler on the swing set. The little girl was laughing, completely carefree, trusting that her mother would keep her safe. I remembered that feeling, that simple faith that the people who love you will protect you. Henry had shattered that faith when he walked into that courtroom 8 years ago. I keep thinking about something my mother used to say, I told Grace. She used to tell me that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's enabling. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences of their choices. Mom was a smart woman, Grace said softly, but she also used to say that everyone deserves a second chance. That people can change if they're truly willing to do the work. Grace sighed. So which piece of Mom's wisdom are you going to follow? That was the question, wasn't it? I'd spent 8 years learning to live without Henry, learning to protect myself from the pain of his betrayal. I'd built a good life, surrounded myself with friends and activities that brought me joy. I was finally at peace with the woman I'd become. But looking at Henry this morning, seeing the genuine shame in his eyes, hearing the way his voice cracked when he talked about becoming someone he didn't recognize, it had stirred something in me I thought was dead and buried. What if I'm strong enough now? I asked. What if 8 years of learning to stand on my own means I can help him without losing myself? And what if you're not? Grace countered. What if he manipulates you again? What if he's learned to be a better liar? What if helping him just enables him to hurt you worse the next time? These were all valid questions, and I didn't have good answers for any of them. I was asking myself to take a leap of faith with someone who'd already proven he could break that faith into pieces. But I kept coming back to something else my mother used to say. The measure of a person isn't whether they fall down. It's whether they get back up and what they do with the lesson. Had Henry learned his lesson? I honestly didn't know, but maybe the real question was whether I'd learned mine. Had 8 years of growth and healing made me wise enough to help without being foolish? Strong enough to set boundaries that would protect me while still extending compassion? I need to pray on this, I said finally. Grace raised an eyebrow. You haven't been to church in 5 years. Maybe it's time I started talking to God again. This feels too big to figure out on my own. That night, after we'd walked back to the house and had an awkward dinner where we all pretended things were normal, I sat on my front porch and did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. Not the formal prayers from church, but the kind of raw, honest conversation with God that happens when you're completely out of your depth. I asked for wisdom. I asked for strength. And I asked for the courage to make the right choice, whatever that might be. Because deep down, I knew I was about to make a decision that would change everything. I made my decision at 3 in the morning, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. Sometimes the biggest choices in life come to you in the quiet darkness, when there's nobody else's voice drowning out the whisper in your heart. The next morning, I found Henry folding the blanket I'd given him for the couch, moving carefully like someone who didn't want to disturb anything. Grace was already up, making coffee with the kind of aggressive efficiency that told me she was still angry about this whole situation. "Henry," I said, "sit down. We need to talk." He looked like he was bracing himself for bad news, which I suppose he was. Grace turned around from the coffee maker, her expression guarded. "I've been thinking all night about what you told us yesterday," I began. "About where you are now, what you need, what kind of future you're looking at." Henry nodded but didn't speak. "I'm not going to pretend that what you did to me didn't happen. You tried to steal my house while I was still living in it. You lied to a judge about my mental capacity. You turned family members against me with half-truths and manipulations. That can't be undone, and I won't pretend it can be." I watched his face fall, saw him start to stand up like he was preparing to leave. "But," I continued, and he froze. "But I also can't pretend that I don't still care about the boy I raised for 18 years. That boy is still somewhere inside you, Henry, and he deserves a chance to figure out how to be a decent man." Grace set her coffee mug down hard enough that it made a sharp sound against the counter. "So here's what I'm willing to do," I said, looking directly at Henry. "I will pay for 1 month's rent on a small apartment here in Boise. Something basic, nothing fancy. I will also give you $500 for food and basic necessities. That's it. That's all the help you get from me." Henry's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I don't know what to say. Thank you. I'll pay you back, I promise." "No," I interrupted firmly. "You won't pay me back, because this isn't a loan. This is me giving you a chance to stand on your own 2 feet. What you do with that chance is entirely up to you." I stood up and walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept important papers, pulled out a manila envelope I'd placed there the night before. "There's something else you need to know," I said, setting the envelope on the table between us. "Back in 2015, right after you filed that lawsuit against me, I did something. I changed the deed on this house." Henry looked confused. Grace raised her eyebrows. This was news to her, too. "If something happens to me, this house doesn't go to you, Henry. It goes to Grace, with instructions that it should be sold, and the money donated to the Boise Public Library system. You will never own this house, no matter what happens in the future." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Henry stared at the envelope, then looked up at me. "I understand," he said quietly. "I earned that. I have no right to complain about it. I'm not telling you this to hurt you," I said. "I'm telling you because I need you to know that any kindness I show you from this point forward isn't because I'm hoping to get something back. It's not because I think you'll take care of me in my old age, or because I'm trying to secure your love or loyalty. It's because it's the right thing to do, and because I can afford to do it without putting myself at risk." Grace was staring at me with something that looked like pride mixed with surprise. Henry just nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "You're giving me a month," he said. 1 month to prove I can be the person you raised me to be." "I'm giving you a month to prove it to yourself," I corrected. "What I think doesn't matter anymore. What matters is whether you can look in the mirror and respect the man you see there." I walked to my purse and pulled out my checkbook, wrote out a check for the first month's rent and another for $500. I slid them across the table to him. "These are the last checks I will ever write to you, Henry. After this month, you're on your own completely. If you succeed, I'll be happy for you. If you fail, I won't be there to catch you. Do you understand?" "Yes," he whispered. "I understand." "Good." I looked at Grace, who was watching this whole exchange with something that might have been approval. "Grace is going to help you find an apartment today. something you can afford on whatever job you manage to find. I wasn't saving Henry. I was giving him the tools to save himself if he was capable of it. Sometimes that's the best love can do. That was 6 months ago. Henry found a small studio apartment across town and got a job at a local hardware store. It's not glamorous work, stocking shelves, helping customers find the right screws and paint colors, but it's honest work that pays the bills. We don't talk often, maybe a phone call once a month where he updates me on how he's doing. He sounds different now. Quieter, more grounded. Whether that's permanent change or just temporary gratitude, only time will tell. I'm not holding my breath for a fairy tale ending. Real life doesn't work that way, especially when trust has been broken as badly as ours was. But I sleep peacefully at night, knowing I made the right choice, not just for Henry, but for myself. I chose compassion over bitterness, but I also chose wisdom over blind love. The deed to my house is still in Grace's name as backup. My boundaries are still firmly in place. I'm still the same woman who learned to live independently, to find joy in my garden and my books and my community work. The difference is that now I know I'm strong enough to help someone without losing myself in the process. Betrayal cuts deep, especially when it comes from family. For those of you watching who've been through something similar, I want you to know this. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the hurt never happened or opening yourself up to be hurt again. Sometimes forgiveness looks like helping from a distance. Sometimes it looks like setting boundaries that protect your peace while still leaving room for hope. Your heart can heal from betrayal, but it's okay to let it heal with some scars. Those scars remind you to be wiser next time, to love with your eyes wide open instead of closed. If this story speaks to you, if you've got your own tale of family betrayal and hard-won wisdom, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggle. And make sure to subscribe to The Cost of Family for more stories like this one. Stories about regular people who faced the worst kind of betrayal and found ways to rebuild their lives stronger than before. Sometimes the family you create through your choices ends up being more reliable than the family you're born into. That's not cynical. That's just honest. And honesty, I've learned, is the foundation everything else gets built on.